At 47, she thought her life was her own. But in her small town, people didn't see Sarah as a woman anymore. They saw her only as a failure. Men laughed at her when she passed the market stalls, women whispered behind cupped hands at church, and children pointed when she walked alone down dusty roads. One evening, after another public humiliation that left her trembling with rage and shame, Sarah's story would take a turn that shocked everyone who ever dared to mock her. The men who called her cursed, the women who said she was too proud, the neighbors who treated her like a walking warning to their daughters, they had no idea how this would end. They thought they knew Sarah's story, but they were about to discover they didn't know Sarah at all. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Williams lived in Millbrook, a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where that business was discussed over morning coffee and evening prayers. At 47, she was the head teacher at the local elementary school, respected for her dedication and feared for her sharp tongue when children misbehaved. But respect in the classroom meant nothing when she walked home to an empty house each night. In Millbrook, a woman without a husband was like a house without a foundation, something people whispered about, something that made them uncomfortable. For well-accomplished women who remain unmarried, the constant stigmatization makes them feel like their lives are less worthy, regardless of their achievements. Sarah felt this every single day. Her neighbors called her Miss Sarah the Spinner behind her back, referencing her unmarried status with barely concealed pity. Her own family worried about her legacy, her sister constantly asking when she would settle down, her mother's friends at church emphasizing during every sermon that no woman should grow old alone. The stakes weren't just about companionship, they were about her reputation, her dignity, and her dwindling hope that love might still find her before it was too late. The mockery started small, like most cruelties do. At first it was just Marcus Thompson at the hardware store making jokes when she bought supplies for her classroom. "Getting ready for another year alone with other people's kids, Miss Sarah," he'd chuckle, and his buddies would snicker behind their coffee cups. Then came Robert Hayes from the gas station, who'd shake his head whenever she filled up her old sedan. "Shame about a woman like you driving around by yourself all the time. Makes a man wonder what's wrong." These comments followed her everywhere. To the grocery store where the butcher would ask if she was cooking for one again, to the post office where the clerk would joke about her only getting bills instead of love letters, but the worst came from David Mitchell, the town's most eligible bachelor who owned 3 businesses and thought his money made his opinions valuable. "Sarah's too picky," he'd announce to anyone who'd listen. "She thinks she's too good for regular folk. That's why she's cursed to be alone." Other men picked up his refrain. "Who marries a woman that age anyway?" They'd ask each other at the barber shop, their voices carrying just far enough for Sarah to hear when she passed by. The gossip spread through the market like wildfire, neighbors whispering theories about why such an educated woman couldn't find herself a husband. Some said she was too proud, others claimed she had a bad temper that drove men away, and a few even suggested she might be cursed. Through it all, Sarah maintained her dignity in public, but at home she poured her pain into journal entries that grew more desperate with each passing month. She knelt beside her bed each night, praying for strength to face another day of sideways glances, and whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. What they didn't know was that Sarah was hiding a secret that would soon come to light, a secret that would change everything about how they saw her, and how Sarah's best friend Rebecca decided she'd had enough of watching her suffer in silence. "I'm going to find you a husband," she declared one afternoon, marching into Sarah's kitchen with the determination of a woman on a mission. "There are good men out there who'd be lucky to have you." The first attempt was Thomas Bradley, a 52-year-old widower who owned a small farm outside town. Rebecca arranged a dinner at the local diner, whispering to Sarah beforehand about his steady income and kind nature. But Thomas spent the entire evening talking about his financial troubles, hinting that he needed someone who could help support his failing business. When he suggested Sarah might want to consider selling her house to invest in his farm, she excused herself to the restroom and never returned to the table. The second attempt was even worse. Jeremy Collins was 38, unmarried, and, according to Rebecca, ready to settle down with a mature woman. But Jeremy treated the entire date like a joke he was playing on his friends. He showed up 20 minutes late, spent the evening texting on his phone, and when the check came he laughed and said, "I forgot my wallet, but I figured a working woman like you wouldn't mind paying." Sarah paid the bill with as much dignity as she could muster, but she could see other diners watching, some of them smirking at what must have looked like a desperate woman buying dinner for a man half interested in her company. The cruelest attempt came from within the church itself. Pastor Williams introduced her to Elder Johnson, a 55-year-old man who'd recently lost his wife to cancer. "He's looking for someone to help him through this difficult time," the pastor explained, and Sarah felt hope flutter in her chest for the first time in months. But Elder Johnson made it clear from their first conversation that he wasn't looking for love, he was looking for a caretaker. "I need someone who can cook, clean, and help me manage my late wife's affairs," he said matter-of-factly. "You seem capable enough, and at your age, I figure you're probably grateful for any opportunity to be useful to a man." Sarah stared at him in disbelief, realizing that even her own church saw her as a charity case rather than a woman deserving of genuine affection. Each failed attempt deepened Sarah's sense of loneliness and shame. She began to withdraw from social gatherings, making excuses to avoid church functions and community events where she'd have to face the pitying looks and whispered conversations. The isolation made everything worse, but she couldn't bear the humiliation of more well-meaning friends trying to fix her broken life. Then, just when Sarah thought she'd reached the bottom of despair, someone decided to spread a rumor that cut deeper than any joke or failed date ever could. Word began to circulate that Sarah had once been engaged to a wealthy businessman from the city, but he'd broken it off when he discovered she couldn't have children. The story wasn't true, but in a small town hungry for explanations, lies often taste sweeter than reality. The cruelest humiliation was yet to come, at a public gathering where everyone would be watching, and where Sarah would finally be forced to make a choice about who she. The annual Harvest Festival was Millbrook's biggest social event, a weekend celebration that brought together every family in town for food, music, and dancing under strings of lights in the community center. Sarah had attended every year since moving to town 15 years ago, but as she stood in her bedroom holding the invitation, she wondered if she had the strength to face another evening of whispered conversations and pitying glances. Rebecca convinced her to come, insisting that hiding at home would only make the gossips talk more. "You're a respected teacher," she reminded Sarah. "You have every right to be there." Ute respect in the classroom didn't translate to respect at the dance. Sarah had barely been there an hour when the comments started. She was standing near the punch table trying to look like she belonged when Marcus Thompson approached with his usual crowd of followers. "Look here, boys," he said loud enough for half the room to hear. "It's Miss Sarah the Spinner herself. You think she's going to try to catch the bouquet when they announce the engagement later?" His friends laughed, but Marcus wasn't done. "Better be careful letting her get too close to the happy couples," he continued, his voice carrying over the music. "Might rub off on them. You know how they say old maids are bad luck." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, but worse was coming. David Mitchell, emboldened by the laughter, decided to join the performance. "Maybe she's here scouting for husband number 0, he called out, causing even more people to turn and stare. Though at her age she might want to lower those standards a bit. Can't be too picky when you're practically collecting Social Security. The laughter grew louder, and Sarah felt her cheeks burning with shame and rage. She could see other women in the crowd, some looking uncomfortable but doing nothing to stop it, others clearly enjoying the spectacle of watching the proud teacher being brought down to size. The final humiliation came when Jeremy Collins, emboldened by alcohol and the crowd's approval, decided to ask the question everyone was thinking but nobody had been cruel enough to voice. "Why don't you just admit it, Miss Sarah? he slurred, swaying slightly as he pointed at her. "No man wants a woman who's dried up like an old piece of fruit. You missed your chance, and now you're just taking up space where a real woman should be standing." The community center fell silent except for the music still playing from the speakers, and Sarah felt every eye in the room fixed on her face, waiting to see how she'd respond to this public execution of her dignity. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, her hands trembling as she fought back tears that threatened to spill over and complete her humiliation. Then, without a word, she set down her punch cup, picked up her purse, and walked toward the exit with her head held high. The crowd parted to let her pass, and she could feel their stares following her all the way to the door. But as she walked through that gauntlet of judgment, something inside Sarah began to shift. The shame that had been crushing her for years started to transform into something harder and more powerful. Walking away that night, Sarah realized she was tired of caring what these people thought of her worth, and soon the entire town would see a side of her they never knew existed. The Monday morning after the Harvest Festival, Sarah Williams walked into Millbrook Elementary School and did something she'd never done in 15 years of teaching. She locked her classroom door during lunch and cried. But they weren't the same tears she'd been shedding in private for months. These were tears of rage, of release, and finally, of resolution. She'd spent too many years measuring her worth by the approval of people who clearly didn't understand the first thing about what made a life valuable. That afternoon, she made a decision that would change everything. Sarah stopped chasing their approval entirely. She deleted the dating apps Rebecca had convinced her to join, canceled her subscription to the matchmaking service she'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone about, and threw away the self-help books about finding love after 40 that had been gathering dust on her nightstand. Instead, she channeled all that energy into something that had always brought her joy: teaching and community service. She started an after-school program for girls whose families couldn't afford tutoring, focusing on math and science skills that would give them opportunities beyond what Millbrook traditionally offered its daughters. The program grew quickly. Parents who'd whispered about Sarah's unmarried status suddenly found themselves grateful for her dedication to their children's futures. She applied for grants, organized fundraising events, and even convinced the school board to let her start a scholarship fund for girls who wanted to pursue higher education. For the first time in years, Sarah felt genuinely useful, genuinely valued for who she was rather than who she wasn't. She stopped checking her reflection for wrinkles, stopped dyeing the gray streaks in her hair, and started wearing clothes that made her feel confident rather than clothes she hoped would make her look younger. Meanwhile, the men who'd mocked her at the festival began facing troubles of their own. Marcus Thompson's hardware store was struggling to compete with the new big-box retailer that opened 30 miles away, and his wife had started asking uncomfortable questions about the money missing from their joint savings account. David Mitchell discovered that his reputation as the town's most eligible bachelor was working against him. Women were starting to see his constant criticism of others as a red flag rather than a sign of high standards. And Jeremy Collins found himself the subject of gossip for once, when his drinking problem became too obvious to ignore, and his family staged an intervention that became the talk of the town. But Sarah barely noticed their struggles. She was too busy building something meaningful, something that would outlast any marriage and matter more than any wedding ring. She just didn't realize that her transformation was about to catch the attention of someone who would change the way the entire village looked at her. And then, out of nowhere, Sarah met someone who saw exactly who she'd become and fell in love with that woman immediately. Dr. Michael Carter arrived in Millbrook on a Tuesday morning in October, driving a modest sedan with out-of-state plates and carrying credentials that impressed even the school superintendent. He was a 45-year-old education consultant, recently divorced, who'd been hired to evaluate rural school programs for potential state funding. His job was to spend 6 weeks observing classes, interviewing teachers, and writing a report that could bring desperately needed resources to schools like Millbrook Elementary. Sarah first noticed him standing in her classroom doorway during her advanced reading group, watching her work with the intensity that made her self-conscious. After class, Dr. Carter introduced himself and asked if they could talk about her after-school program. "I've been reviewing the applications for state funding," he explained, "and your girls' education initiative is exactly the kind of innovative program we're looking to support." They spent the next hour discussing curriculum development, community engagement, and Sarah's long-term vision for expanding opportunities for rural students. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself talking to a man who was genuinely interested in her thoughts, her work, and her dreams for the future, rather than her availability for companionship. Their professional relationship evolved naturally into friendship over the following weeks. Michael would stop by her classroom after school to discuss his findings, often staying to help her organize materials for the next day's lessons. He had an easy laugh and a way of listening that made Sarah feel heard rather than judged. When she mentioned that she'd been developing her own teaching methods but hadn't had time to write them down formally, he offered to help her document them for potential publication. "Your insights could help teachers across the state," he told her. "You shouldn't keep this wisdom to yourself." The first time Michael asked Sarah to have dinner with him, she almost said no out of habit. "I should probably warn you," she said carefully. "People in this town have some strong opinions about women my age who haven't settled down." Michael looked genuinely confused by her warning. "I'm not interested in the town's opinions," he replied. "I'm interested in getting to know the woman who's built something this impressive while everyone else was just talking." That evening, over dinner at a restaurant 2 towns away where nobody would recognize them, Sarah told Michael about the years of mockery, the failed setups, and the growing certainty that she was destined to be alone. Michael listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You know what I see when I look at you?" he finally said. "I see someone who refused to compromise her values for the approval of people who don't matter. I see someone who took her pain and turned it into purpose. And I see someone who's been waiting for the right person, instead of settling for just anyone." He reached across the table and touched her hand gently. "Love isn't about age, Sarah. It's about finding someone whose soul matches yours." For the first time in decades, Sarah felt herself beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd been waiting for exactly the right reason. News traveled fast in Millbrook, and by the end of the week, everyone knew that the visiting education consultant had been seen having dinner with Miss Sarah the Spinner. The gossip started immediately. Some people were genuinely happy for her, but others seemed almost offended that she'd found companionship after they'd written her off as hopeless. The men who'd mocked her at the Harvest Festival were particularly vocal about their disapproval, though their criticism now had an edge of jealousy that hadn't been there before. David Mitchell made the first move, approaching Michael after a school board meeting with what he probably thought was friendly advice. "You seem like a nice fellow," he said, "but you should know what you're getting into with Sarah. She's been alone this long for good reasons, set in her ways, probably can't have kids, definitely too proud for her own good. Might want to look around for someone more flexible." Michael listened politely until David finished his speech, then smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for your concern," he replied, "but I'm quite capable of making my own judgments about the people I choose to spend time with." Marcus Thompson tried a different approach, cornering Sarah at the grocery store to offer his own unsolicited opinions. "I hope you're not getting your hopes up too high," he said, blocking her path to the checkout lane. "Men like that don't stick around places like this. Soon as his work's done, he'll be gone, and you'll be right back where you started." Sarah looked at him steadily, remembering how small and ashamed his words used to make her feel. "Marcus," she said calmly, "I've built a life I'm proud of, with or without anyone else's approval. If Michael chooses to be part of it, that's wonderful. If he doesn't, I'll continue being exactly who I am, which is more than enough." But the real test came the following Friday evening, when Sarah and Michael attended the town's monthly community dinner together. They walked into the community center hand in hand, and Sarah could feel the weight of every stare, could hear the sudden hush in conversations as people noticed them together. Jeremy Collins, apparently having learned nothing from his previous public embarrassment, had been drinking again and decided this was his moment to play hero. He approached their table with exaggerated concern, directing his comments to Michael while pointing at Sarah. "Friend, I don't know what she's told you," he slurred loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "but you should know the truth about what you're getting into. She's barren, she's cursed, and she's been chasing men around this town for years. Ask anyone here, they'll tell you the same thing." The community center fell silent, just like it had at the Harvest Festival, and Sarah felt that familiar knot of shame beginning to form in her stomach. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't alone. Sarah stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor in the silence, and when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the room. "You're right about one thing, Jeremy," she said calmly. "People here will tell you all sorts of things about me. They'll tell you I'm too proud, too picky, too old, too set in my ways. They'll tell you I'm cursed because I chose education over early marriage, career over convenience, dignity over desperation." She paused, looking around the room at faces she'd known for years. "But what they won't tell you is that I've spent the last 15 years teaching your children, improving this community, and building something meaningful with my life. My worth was never defined by your approval, and it certainly isn't diminished by your disapproval now." She sat back down and reached for Michael's hand, her message clear. She was no longer hiding from their judgment, and she was no longer asking for their permission to be happy. The shift in Millbrook didn't happen overnight, but it happened steadily. After that evening at the community dinner, something fundamental changed in how people saw Sarah Williams. The younger women in town, especially the teachers and working mothers, began to see her not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of what it meant to build a life on your own terms. They started asking her advice about career decisions, education choices for their daughters, and how to balance personal fulfillment with social expectations. Sarah found herself mentoring women who'd previously viewed her with pity, helping them navigate challenges she understood all too well. The men who'd shamed her gradually lost influence in community discussions. Marcus Thompson's financial troubles became public knowledge when he had to sell his hardware store to avoid bankruptcy, and people began to question the judgment of someone who couldn't manage his own affairs. David Mitchell's reputation as a catch diminished further when it became clear that his criticism of Sarah had been rooted in his own insecurity about commitment. Several women came forward to share stories about his habit of leading them on before disappearing when relationships became serious. And Jeremy Collins found himself increasingly isolated as his drinking problem worsened and his family distanced themselves from his behavior. Meanwhile, Sarah's relationship with Michael deepened into something beautiful and genuine. He extended his consulting contract to help implement the funding her program had received, and eventually made the decision to relocate permanently to the area. Their engagement announcement in the local paper was met with widespread congratulation from people who'd genuinely grown to respect what Sarah had built, though some of the old guard grumbled about outsiders coming in and changing things. But Sarah no longer cared about their grumbling. She'd learned the difference between people whose opinions mattered and people who just liked to hear themselves talk. The wedding itself was a small, elegant affair held in the school garden Sarah had helped design and plant. Her students served as flower girls, scattering petals from the vegetables they'd grown in the learning garden. Her former critics were notably absent, but their absence felt like a gift rather than a slight. Sarah was surrounded by people who celebrated her happiness rather than people who'd spent years undermining it. Even her family, who'd worried for so long about her unmarried status, finally understood that Sarah had been waiting for the right person rather than just any person who'd have her. The most meaningful moment came during the reception, when several of her former students, now young women themselves, stood to toast their teacher. "Miss Sarah taught us that our value isn't determined by other people's timelines," one of them said. "She showed us that it's better to wait for real love than to settle for convenient approval." Sarah looked around the room at faces filled with genuine affection and respect, and realized that she was no longer Miss Sarah the Spinner. She was Sarah Williams Carter, the woman who'd proven that dignity doesn't have an expiration date, that love doesn't follow social schedules, and that the best revenge against mockery is living a life so fulfilling that their opinions. 5 years later, Sarah Williams Carter stood in front of her classroom, watching her students work on a project about personal goals and community service. The walls were covered with awards her education program had received, letters from students who'd gone on to college with her scholarship support, and photographs from community events, where she was recognized not as the unmarried teacher, but as an educational leader who'd transformed opportunities for young people in rural areas. The whispers that had once followed her through grocery stores and church services had been replaced by requests for her expertise, invitations to speak at conferences, and genuine friendships with people who valued her contributions. Michael worked down the hall now, having taken a permanent position as the district's curriculum coordinator. Their marriage had settled into the kind of comfortable partnership Sarah had stopped believing was possible for her, built on mutual respect, shared values, and the deep satisfaction of supporting each other's dreams rather than compromising them. They'd never had children of their own, but their house was frequently filled with former students who'd become like family, young women who sought Sarah's advice about college applications, career decisions, and the courage to pursue paths that others might not understand. The same voices that had once laughed at Sarah now spoke of her with something approaching awe. At community meetings, her opinions carried weight. At social gatherings, people sought her company rather than avoiding her presence. The transformation wasn't about finding a husband, it was about finding herself, claiming her worth, and refusing to let other people's limitations define her possibilities. She'd learned that the most powerful response to mockery isn't anger or defensiveness, but the quiet confidence that comes from building a life so meaningful that criticism becomes background noise you barely notice. On quiet evenings, Sarah sometimes thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, ashamed, desperate for approval, measuring her worth by other people's opinions. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she remembered with compassion but couldn't quite recognize. The journey from shame to self-respect hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. She'd discovered that dignity isn't something you're given. It's something you claim, something you defend, and something you model for others who might be struggling to find their own way. What do you think about Sarah's journey? Should she have forgiven the people who mocked her for so many years? Or was her quiet success the most powerful response she could have given? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between other people's approval and your own self-respect? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you the way it did with us, hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring stories about people who refuse to let others define their worth. We share tales of courage, transformation, and the power of believing in yourself every week, and we'd hate for you to miss what's coming next.